It was a Tuesday morning in late March of 1987, and the sky sat low and the color of old pewter, the kind of sky that makes the bare trees look like they were drawn in pencil on gray paper. I remember the exact date, because I had just come in from walking the south edge of the property, and I wrote it in the top margin of my notebook the way my grandmother used to. Date first, then weather, then what the ground told me. The temperature was 31 degrees, and there was a skim of ice on the low puddles along the fence line. And Roy Hester was leaning on the gate post, laughing. Not a mean laugh. Roy never had a mean bone in him. But it was a laugh that said he had already made up his mind about what I was doing and what would come of it. He said, 65 acres of reed and muck for $65, Clara. And you think you got a bargain? I didn't answer him. I just looked back out at those reeds, brown and stiff as old broom handles, standing 8 feet tall in places, and I thought about what my grandmother Hattie had written in her ledger 31 years before that morning. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? She had written it in pencil, her handwriting tight and slanted the way people wrote when paper was not something you wasted. She wrote, "The ground that won't be hurried will reward the one who won't be rushed." I had read that line so many times the pencil marks were faint along the tops of the letters where my thumb had passed over them. I carried that ledger in my coat pocket the morning Roy laughed at me. I did not take it out to show him. Some things you keep to yourself until the ground proves them for you. I want to tell you how 65 acres of reed-choked bottomland that I paid $1 an acre for in the winter of 1987 became the most instructive piece of ground I ever stood on. I want to tell you about the old mill race my hogs rooted out of the muck, and what that ditch told me about the people who had worked that ground before any of us were born, and what it cost me to believe it. This is not a story about getting rich. The numbers at the end are honest and modest. It is a story about reading ground slowly enough to hear what it is trying to say. The land sat at the bottom of a long, gradual slope at the southeast corner of Park County, Indiana. The previous holder had been an elderly man named Aldous Veach, who had farmed the upland acres above it for 40 years and had simply stopped trying to do anything with the low ground sometime around 1971. Before Aldous, the land had been held by a family called Greer, who had run sheep on the upland, and according to the courthouse records I read on a Thursday afternoon in February of 1987, had attempted to drain the bottomland in 1934 and again in 1941. The 1934 attempt left a partial ditch along the west margin, about 60 yards of it before the records went quiet. The 1941 attempt was not recorded at all except as a notation in the tax assessor's remarks that said, quote, "Drainage attempted, ground uncooperative, ground uncooperative." I had a feeling the ground was not the uncooperative party in that arrangement. I was 43 years old that March of 1987. I had been farming the 38 upland acres I inherited from my father since 1971, running a small cow-calf operation, and a kitchen garden that my mother had started in 1958. The upland ground was good, red, and well drained, and it had been patient with me while I learned what I was doing. But the 65 bottomland acres had been sitting at the edge of my thinking since I was a girl. My grandmother Hattie had grown up 2 miles east of that piece of ground. She had talked about it the way Some people talk about a difficult relative with a mixture of exasperation and respect. She said the old Greer bottom land had been sweet ground once before people started trying to force it. That was the word she used. Force. She died in January of 1979, 8 years before I stood there with Roy Hester laughing at the gate. She left me her ledger, a composition book, with a brown speckled cover, the kind you could buy at a dime store. Inside it, she had kept notes from roughly 1948 through 1976, observations about soil and water, and the behavior of animals on wet ground. She had kept hogs for 30 years, a small herd of mixed heritage animals she ran on a 40-acre woodlot 2 miles north of town. She was one of the last people in the county who ran hogs in the old way, letting them range and root rather than confining them, and she had written down everything she noticed. The ledger was not a diary. It was closer to a field notebook written by someone who had no formal education past the 8th grade, and yet observed the land with a precision that would have satisfied any agronomist I have ever met. On page 47 of that ledger, dated the 12th of September of 1962, she had written the following, and I am going to read it to you exactly as she wrote it. She said, "Ran the 4 older sows along the creek bottom east of Veach's line. They rooted continuous from the sandbar to the old willow, about 60 steps. In 2 days they had opened ground 18 inches down in places, found old cut stone at 22 inches, dressed flat, set level, old drainage I think. Ground above it was black and different from the surrounding clay, smelled right. I think there is a whole system under that reed bed that nobody has bothered to find because they are looking at the reeds instead of what is under them." She wrote it again at the bottom of the same page, the way she sometimes did when she wanted to remember something. "I think there is a whole system under that reed bed that nobody has bothered to find because they are looking at the reeds instead of what is under them." I read that page for the first time in the spring of 1979, a few months after she died, and I read it again perhaps 40 times over the next 8 years before I finally did something about it. People ask me why it took 8 years. The honest answer is that I was not ready. The upland operation was still finding its legs. I had debt from a used tractor I bought in 1974, a 1966 model that cost me $1,900 and needed a rebuilt head by 1977, which ran me another $410. I had years when the calf prices made me sit at the kitchen table and add the same column of numbers 3 times hoping they would change. I was not in a position to take on 65 acres of ground that 3 previous efforts had declared uncooperative. But I kept the ledger in my coat pocket, and I kept reading that page. The man I talked to first about it, really talked to, was my neighbor Ezra Cummins, who had farmed the ground west of mine for 20 years and who had the quality I valued most in a person to talk to, which was that he listened completely before he said anything. I told him what Hattie had written. I told him what I was thinking about the low ground. He was quiet for what felt like a full minute, looking out at his own fields. Then he said, "I said $65 for the land if Aldous Veach would take it, and I thought he would." Ezra said, "That is not very much money to spend on a question that has been sitting in your coat pocket for 8 years. He did not say I was right. He did not say I was wrong. He asked what it cost to find out. And that was enough. I bought the 65 acres from Aldous Veach on the 14th of February of 1987 for $65, which worked out to exactly $1 per acre. Aldous was 81 years old, and he had been trying to sell that bottomland since 1971, and nobody had made him a serious offer, partly because the county assessed it at $11 an acre. The deed transferred on a Saturday. The following Tuesday, I walked the south edge, and Roy Hester leaned on the gatepost and laughed. I did not bring the hogs down right away. I spent the first spring and summer of 1987 walking the perimeter of those 65 acres at different times of day and in different weather. I want to be precise about what I was doing because it is easy to make it sound mystical, and it was not mystical. It was methodical. I was reading the surface of the ground the way my grandmother had taught me to read it, looking for the places where water moved differently than it did 10 feet away, looking for changes in the color and texture of the soil at the edges of the reed beds, looking for the particular quality of muck that she had described in the ledger as smelling right. She had meant that it smelled ferrous and organic, not sour and septic, the way truly dead ground smells. There is a difference, and it is not subtle once you know it. By August of 1987, I had walked that perimeter 22 times, which works out to roughly 3 times a month from March through August. I had filled 14 pages of my own notebook with observations. I had identified 3 locations along the east and central portions of the bottomland where the reed growth was notably denser and taller than the surrounding stands, which my grandmother's notes suggested was often a sign of concentrated organic material and subsurface water movement. Dense and tall in that context means not a problem, but a pointer. The reeds were pointing at something. I borrowed a soil probe from the county extension office, a 48-inch model, on a Thursday in September of 1987. The extension agent who handed it to me was a young man named Darrell Finch, maybe 28 years old, who had been in the county about a year. He asked what I intended to probe. I told him. He said, "That bottomland has been looked at before and they found it uncooperative." Used the same word the tax assessor had used in 1941, and I wondered if it was in the files somewhere. He said the tile drainage equipment rental ran about $400 a day if I found something worth draining. I thanked him and took the probe. On the 19th of September of 1987, a Friday, at the first of the 3 dense reed locations I had identified, I pushed the probe down through 51 inches of dark organic material and hit resistance. I pulled it and pushed it again 6 inches to the left and hit resistance at 49 inches. I marked the spot with a length of orange survey tape tied to a reed stem and moved to the second location. At the second location, I hit resistance at 38 inches. At the third location, 33 inches. The resistance was not bedrock. It was too uniform and too flat for bedrock. It had the sound and feel, and I know that sounds like I am overclaiming. But there is a sound that comes back up through a probe when you hit dressed stone that is different from gravel and different from hardpan clay. And I had hit enough of each over the years to know the difference. I stood in that reed bed on that September Friday with orange tape on 3 stems, and I thought about my grandmother writing on page 47, "Found old cut stone at 22 inches, dressed flat, set level." I went home and read the page again that night. Then I read it a 3rd time. I have to tell you about the doubt, because the story is not honest without it. That winter, November and December of 1987, and January of 1988, I had 3 separate nights where I sat with the ledger in my lap and thought seriously about whether I was building a theory out of an old woman's field notes, The bottomland was costing me nothing in direct expense because I had paid $65 for it, and there was nothing on it to maintain. But time is not free. I had spent the better part of a growing season walking those 65 acres when I could have been improving my upland pasture, which genuinely needed attention. The cost was not money. The cost was the slow accumulation of being the woman who bought the reed swamp for $65 and spent her Saturdays poking it with a borrowed probe, while Roy Hester and Darrell Finch, on the worst of those nights, which was the 11th of January of 1988, a Monday, cold enough that the kitchen windows had condensation frozen at the corners, I opened the ledger to page 47. The ground that won't be hurried will reward the one who won't be rushed. My grandmother had written that in September of 1962. She had been walking wet ground her entire adult life, and she had written that sentence not as a consolation, but as a conclusion. The way you write something down when you have tested it enough times to stop doubting it. I decided to trust her conclusion over my own impatience. I decided to bring the hogs down in spring. The herd I brought to the bottomland in April of 1988 was 7 animals. 4 of them were mature sows, 3 years old or older, and the other 3 were a boar, and 2 younger females I was developing. The breeds were mixed, what my grandmother would have recognized as a working herd rather than a show herd, rooty and deep through the shoulder, built for groundwork. I had been running them on the woodlot adjacent to my upland pasture since 1983, 5 years, and they had rooted that woodlot comprehensively enough that I knew what they could do in soft ground. I moved them to the bottomland on the 9th of April, 1988, a Saturday, in a borrowed stock trailer that Ezra Cummins drove while I followed in my truck. The bottomland was not fully fenced at that point. I want to be clear about the sequence, because the money matters. I had put in a perimeter fence along the north and east margins in the fall of 1987, running about 900 linear feet of used woven wire I bought from a farm sale in October for $42. The south and west margins I had not fenced yet, because I wanted to see where the hogs wanted to work before I committed the fence line. The south margin backed up to an old hedge line that was intact enough to hold hogs reasonably well, and the west margin was a drainage ditch that the animals wouldn't cross voluntarily, so the containment was adequate for the first season, if not elegant. I ran the hogs on the north and east portions of the bottomland through the spring and early summer of 1988. They worked the ground the way mature rooting hogs work soft ground, systematically moving in loosely parallel passes through the reed stands, turning the brute mass and muck to a depth of 12 to 18 inches on average. I measured this not by guessing, but by pushing a steel rod into their worked ground behind them and marking the depth of disturbed material with a paint mark. 12 inches was common. 14 was common in the softer areas near the center. 18 inches occurred at 7 specific locations, all of them in or adjacent to the 3 dense reed stands. On the 3rd of June of 1988, a Friday afternoon, one of the older sows, a large red-gray animal who had always been the most aggressive rooter in the herd, broke through into something. I was not there when it happened. I was at the north end of the property checking the fence line when I heard the change in her behavior, the particular high, excited rooting sound that means a hog has found something interesting at depth. By the time I walked down to her location, she had her snout 18 inches into a cavity in the ground and was working sideways along it. I got her out of the depression with a bucket of corn and looked at what she had found. Dressed flat stone, cut with some kind of iron tool, set in a line running roughly northeast to southwest. The stones were each about 22 inches wide and perhaps 4 inches thick, set edge to edge, with a mortar between them that had gone to powder in most places, but held form in a few. The channel they formed was approximately 16 inches across at the interior. It was a mill race, or the remnant of one, the kind of hand-dug, stone-lined water conveyance that was built in this part of Indiana from roughly the 1,820 through the 1,870 to carry water from a head source to a mill wheel. I stood in that broken reed bed on a June afternoon in 1988, looking at cut limestone that someone had set by hand, probably 120 years before I was standing there, and I thought about my grandmother writing, "I think there is a whole system under that reed bed that nobody has bothered to find." She had written that in 1962, 26 years before the Sioux broke through to it. I called Ezra Cummins that evening and told him what we had found. He was quiet for the usual full minute. Then he said, "Well, that was all. Well." But he said it in a way that contained a considerable amount. The mill race ran, as we eventually traced it, over the following 8 weeks for approximately 340 feet through the bottomland, entering at the northeast corner from the direction of a creek that had been partially rerouted at some point, and running southwest toward the remains of a stone foundation at the far corner of the property that I had always assumed was a collapsed root cellar. It was not a root cellar. It was the base structure of a water mill, probably a small grist mill, the sill stones still in place and level, the surrounding ground heavily disturbed by previous clearing attempts that had apparently stopped short of removing the foundation itself. The mill race fed that foundation. 340 feet of hand-laid limestone channel, buried under 51 years of reed growth and silt accumulation, running through my $65 bottomland. I want to be exact about what the mill race meant, agronomically, because the history is interesting, but the ground is what I was farming. A stone-lined channel of that construction, even one that had been occluded by silt and root mass for 5 decades, still functioned as a subsurface drainage spine, pestren. The limestone itself was porous enough at the mortar joints to allow lateral water movement, and the channel interior, once the hogs had broken through at multiple points, and I had cleared the debris manually, began to move water. Slowly at first. Then with increasing consistency, as the spring rains of 1989 saturated the surrounding ground. By June of 1989, the channel was carrying a measurable flow, and the ground within 40 feet of its center line on either side had dropped its water table by an estimated 8 to 10 inches relative to the surrounding bottomland, based on observation holes I dug at measured intervals. 8 to 10 inches, that is not a dramatic number. That is the difference between ground that will not grow a useful crop and ground that will. Darrell Finch came out on a July morning in 1989. He had heard about it in the way news moves in a rural county, which is completely and without any effort on anyone's part. He walked the line of the mill race with me, crouching at the open sections where the hogs had broken through and where I had done additional hand clearing, and he spent a long time at the mill foundation looking at the sill stones. He had brought a water level and a soil moisture meter and a notebook of his own, and he took readings at 11 points along the drainage corridor. At the end of it, he stood up and looked at the numbers in his notebook for what felt like 2 full minutes without speaking. He said, "I don't have a category for this in my drainage assessment forms. I said. I imagine not. He said that mill race is doing what a modern lateral tile system would cost you $8,000 to $12,000 to install, and it has been in the ground for approximately 150 years. He did not say I had been right. He did not say the extension office had been wrong. He said he did not have a category for it. He said the mill race was functioning, and then he wrote it all down in his notebook, and he filed a report with the State Agricultural Preservation Office the following month, which I did not know until I received a letter from them in September of 1989, asking if I would consent to a survey of the site for historical and agricultural documentation purposes. The survey team came out in October of 1989, 4 people with measuring equipment and cameras, and they spent 2 days on the property and produced a report that I have a copy of that runs to 41 pages. On page 12 of that report, they estimated the mill race was constructed between 1848 and 1862, based on the tool marks on the stone and the construction method of the mortar joints. She had walked that ground 60 years after the mill race was laid, looked at the reed stands, noticed the stone at 22 inches under the creek edge, and written down what she thought was beneath the rest of it. She had been right about the system. She had been right about the ground smelling right. She had been right that people were looking at the reeds instead of what was under them. Roy Hester came by in the fall of 1990, October. A dry, bright Saturday, when I had the hogs back on the south portion of the bottomland working the last of the unbroken reed areas. He stood at the gate and looked out at the ground for a while. He could see where the reed cover had been opened up over 2/3 of the acreage, and he could see that the exposed ground worked and turned by the hogs and then left to settle and green up through the summer was showing a different color from the surrounding untouched areas, darker and more consistent. He looked at the mill foundation in the far corner, looked at the hogs working. He said, "I did not think you had anything here, Clara." I said, "I know." He said, "I was wrong about that." Then he was quiet for a while, and then he said he had to get back, and he left. That was all, but he said it, and he meant it. I want to tell you the numbers, because I think they are honest. And they are what this story is actually about. Not the history of the mill race, though that history is real and documented, and not the idea that I outsmarted anyone. I read my grandmother's notes slowly enough to believe them, and I bought 65 acres of ground for $65 because nobody else was reading carefully enough to see what she had seen. By the end of the 1990 grazing season, I had run hogs on that bottomland for 3 seasons. The hog operation in those 3 years, accounting for feed costs, veterinary expenses. The fence completion I finished in 1989, which ran me $430, and the transport costs for moving, not per year, across 3 years. That is not a figure that would impress anyone looking for a get-rich story. But the hogs had not been the primary economic event. They had been the mechanism. The primary economic event was what the ground became. By 1991, I had 31 acres of the 65 in a grass and legume mix that was producing hay at a rate of 2.5 tons per acre, per cut 2 cuts per second easen, on ground that 3 years earlier had been standing water and 8-foot reeds. 31 acres at 2.5 tons per cut. 2 cuts is 155 tons of hay per year off that acreage alone. At the 1991 Local market price of $41 per ton. That is $6,355 per year from the hay ground alone. The remaining 34 acres I kept in rotational hog pasture, and the emerging bottomland woodland I was managing along the creek margin, which I did not try to convert, because my grandmother's notes had been explicit that the creek margin ground was best left in permanent cover. I also want to account for the full cost, honestly. The $65 for the land, the $42 for the used woven wire in 1987, the $61 for the posts, the fence completion in 1989 at $430. Hog feed over 3 seasons, which I calculated at the end of 1990 as approximately $2,100 total, accounting for the significant forage and mast the animals were harvesting on their own. Veterinary costs over the same period, $418, 2 replacement sows purchased in 1989 at $65 each. 1 soil probe rental, a nominal fee of $12. Miscellaneous hand tools and fencing hardware, perhaps another $90 across the period. The total investment through the end of 1990 was approximately $3,358. Against that, I set the $4,210 net from the hog operation across those 3 years, which meant the bottomland had returned its full investment cost before the hay operation produced its first cutting. The hay income beginning in 1991 was therefore income from ground that had cost me nothing remaining to recover. I am telling you these numbers not because they are large, but because I think the precision of them is part of the story. My grandmother did not keep imprecise records. She wrote down measurements and observations in pencil in a composition book because she understood that the ground would not argue with you if you wrote down what it actually did rather than what you hoped it would do. I learned to keep records the same way. The ground will tell you the truth if you write down what you observe rather than what you want to observe. The State Historical Commission, following the survey report filed by Darrell Finch's referral in 1989, designated the Mill Race and Foundation as an agricultural heritage site in the county in the spring of 1992. There is a small cast-iron marker at the edge of the property along the road. It gives the estimated construction date of the mill as between 1848 and 1862, and notes that the site was identified through agricultural use, specifically through the rooting activity of a managed hog herd. I had nothing to do with the wording of that marker. The commission wrote it. But I want to tell you that when I read the proof copy they sent me before they installed it, I sat at my kitchen table for a while with the marker text in one hand and my grandmother's ledger open to page 47 in the other, and I thought about the distance between what she had written in 1962 and how that distance was mostly just time and patience, and reading the page carefully enough to believe it. The ground that won't be hurried will reward the one who won't be rushed. She wrote that as a conclusion. I have spent the years since 1988 arriving at the same conclusion by a longer road, which is the usual way conclusions are reached by people who have to learn them rather than inherit them already finished. I think the difference between a problem and a resource is often just the angle of attention. I think people look at reeds and see an obstacle when the reeds are actually a report. They are reporting on the ground beneath them, on the water that is moving or failing to move, on the history of whoever put stone or tile or ditch in the earth before the living memory. You have to be willing to look at them as a report rather than an obstacle. And that willingness takes longer to develop than most people want to spend on 65 acres of bottomland that a tax assessor once called uncooperative. My grandmother Hattie is buried on a hillside cemetery 2 miles east of that property. I have visited her grave enough times that I know the sound the gravel makes on the path when the weather is dry. I have not said much to her on those visits. She was not a person who required elaboration, but I think she would have appreciated the cast-iron marker. I think she would have read it twice the way she read her own conclusions in the ledger, the first time to take it in and the second time to be sure it said what she thought it said. And then she would have walked the ground again to make sure the marker matched what the ground actually did, because that was who she was, and that was how she taught me to see. If you have a piece of ground that someone told you was uncooperative, or a record left by someone older and quieter than the current conversation, or a question that has been sitting in your coat pocket long enough that the edges of it are soft, leave it in the comments below. I mean that genuinely. The ground is different everywhere, and the lessons are different everywhere, but the patience is the same patience, and it is worth talking about.